Before we start, I'd just like to make a brief promotional message for this talk tomorrow. It's by Danielle Citron from the University of Maryland with commentary by Brett Frischman and myself. It's in Lewis Library tomorrow, 4:30, room 120, on why fighting online abuse is good for free speech. And it's the first in the 3-event series called Free Speech Now. Also, before we start, I want to thank some people. First of all, I would like to thank my family for allowing this whole thing to happen, for moving to Washington, moving back from Washington, and having me very absent a lot of the time while in Washington. So thank you. Second, I want to thank all of my colleagues from the White House. One of my colleagues, DJ Patil, always said that this is a team sport, what we were doing. It's a team sport. It's a team sport, he was always saying, and that's really true. As you will hear, working there is a very intense and challenging job, and my colleagues there were a big part of what made it enjoyable, fun, and a learning experience. So I don't think any of you are here. Maybe some of you are watching this on video now or later. Colleagues, thank you. And then finally, I want to thank Princeton University for giving me the leave and helping to be flexible with regard to funding so that I could do the leave in Washington. So thanks to the university as well. All right. In May of 2015, I took a leave from Princeton and moved down to Washington to spend 20 months working in the White House as Deputy United States Chief Technology Officer. I want to talk today about what I learned while doing that. A lot of what people think they know about the White House comes from depictions on television. Media portrayals of the White House differ, but in recent years we've seen 3 prominent models. In the West Wing, earnest, idealistic, hardworking staffers solve the nation's problems while talking and walking briskly down hallways. West Wing characters have their quirks and their flaws, but they're dedicated and super competent. Fundamentally, they're the kind of people that you would want to have working in the White House. Aspects of the West Wing were certainly accurate. For example, there was a lot of walking and talking. Some of us walked and talked because our offices were so small. But even some people who had big private offices liked to walk and talk. For example, Dennis McDonough, President Obama's chief of staff, liked to go for a walk on the South Lawn when it was time for a serious talk about something. And the people, on the whole, were incredibly dedicated and competent. And on the whole, they were exactly the kind of people that you would hope would be working at the White House. On Veep, ego, incompetence, and bureaucratic dysfunction are the norm at the highest levels of government. And that makes for great comedy. In real life, dumb little errors do show up. A typical Veep plot point might involve somebody who had to meet with VIPs but forgot to bring socks to work. And that actually did happen to one of my colleagues. He had dress shoes, yes, but no socks, due to a complicated story involving exercise and doctor appointments. So things like that did happen, but they weren't the everyday experience. On the other hand, what is true about the White House is that it's in an environment where little mistakes get magnified, especially in public-facing events and documents. And if you're short-staffed, overworked, and sleep-deprived, mistakes are going to happen. So there was just a little bit of Veep as well. House of Cards is a version of Washington that's driven by deception and limitless will to power. Now, deception and will to power are not unknown in Washington. I'm sure you're not surprised to hear that. But to be clear, unlike House of Cards, I did not see any actual bloodshed. So, was the White House like the media depictions? In some ways, yes. In others, no. I saw aspects of all 3 of these shows. I might have done 1 or 2 incompetent things, and I might have been a teeny bit diabolical once or twice, in a good cause, of course. But there was a lot in the experience that you don't see in the media. If we had our own show, maybe the opening credits would look something like this. This is an actual action shot, and this is as fast and furious as the action ever gets. I want to talk today, though, about what my experience there was like. And I'm going to switch back and forth between two different modes. I'll talk about some serious policy matters, some of the important things that we worked on. And I'll also take some detours to give you a flavor of the place and the experience and what it was like to work there. Let me tell you about this. This was the first time I met the president and my first time setting foot in the Oval Office. I was there to give the president a detailed briefing about a broad technical topic and its policy implications. One half of my brain was freaking out. I'm in the Oval Office, and that's the president, the actual president right there. And he just asked me a question, and now I have to move my mouth and make words. And I better say something good because he seems really smart. And there's a photographer over there who's recording the whole thing. And the other half of my brain was 100% focused. And I knew that I'd prepared meticulously, and I was as ready as I could be for whatever he might ask. And I also knew that the president's time was precious, and I needed to get to the point. As my time at the White House went on, this kind of thing no longer elicited the freak-out reaction. Meeting with the president or senior officials, being in the Oval Office or the Situation Room, these were things that I still appreciated, but that no longer freaked me out. But the urgency of what we were doing, not only at moments like this, but really all the time, that never went away. Not every moment was as intense as this one, but the overall intensity and the pace of the job is one of the things that I'm going to remember most. Okay, let me tell you a little bit more about what my job was. My title was, here's my business card, my title was Deputy United States Chief Technology Officer. My boss was Megan Smith, the Chief Technology Officer of the United States. Her boss was the president. I was part of the U.S. CTO team. Here's a photo from one of our offsite meetings. The team's main job was to advise the president and his senior advisors on policy issues relating to technology. To be clear, we were policy advisors. We were not the people responsible for making the IT systems work across the government. That's the Chief Information Officer. Nor were we responsible for IT in the White House. That's the White House IT office. Nor were we responsible for social media or technology-enabled outreach to the public. That was the Office of Digital Strategy. Nor were we responsible for building and operating the actual technologies that government relied on. That's done by various teams across all of the departments and agencies. We were policy advisors, so our job was to make words, to give advice, and to be instigators. We had three main missions. The first mission was to increase the technological capacity of the government. That meant changing things to empower the great tech people who were already working in the government. And it meant bringing even more great tech people into the government, like the U.S. Digital Service team that is shown in this image. The second mission was to increase the nation's capability to build and use technologies. This included helping to devise pro-technology and pro-innovation policies, to improve technology education, to boost research and development, and to push for technical knowledge and opportunities to be available to every American, so that as a nation we can put our whole team on the field. And the third mission was to make sure that public policy decisions were informed by the best knowledge and expertise in technology. And note that I didn't limit that to policy decisions about technology, because nowadays many decisions that don't seem to be about technology have an important technology angle. Let me give you a couple examples of that. Anthony Fox was the U.S. Secretary of Transportation for the last 4 years of the Obama administration. Secretary Fox said that during his confirmation process, technology topics like self-driving vehicles and drones never came up. Never came up in his confirmation hearing, never came up in his discussions with senators before the hearing. Those issues just were not on the radar. But during his time as secretary, technology-driven issues were among the most important things he had to deal with. In ground transportation, the most important development these days is self-driving vehicles. By Secretary Fox's time in office, these had gone far beyond science fiction. The first ones were already on the roads in the United States. If you've been to Pittsburgh recently, you've probably seen quite a few of Uber's self-driving vehicles, like up here in the upper left. Google's cars are on the road too, and there's many others. Major automakers say they plan to sell fully self-driving vehicles on a wide scale by the 2021 model year. Self-driving trucks are being tested too. This may not have been on the radar in 2013, but it became one of the most important transportation policy issues. In aviation, a major issue is drones. Drones are now cheap and plentiful, and they're increasingly capable thanks to advances in technology. They also raise some very complex regulatory and safety issues. When Secretary Fox came into office, there was no regulatory structure at all allowing the commercial use of drones in the United States. To a first approximation, there was not a way to use a drone for commercial purposes outdoors in the United States, period. Industry and the public were pushing for rapid changes, but the FAA had a duty to protect safety as these changes happened. There's another technology-driven challenge that Secretary Fox and his team faced. And at the bottom here, by the way, what you see is a flying car. Not science fiction. This is a product that's being tested today. There's multiple companies testing flying cars in the United States today. And there's absolutely no clear picture of how to fit a product like this into today's regulatory structure. Near the end of his time in office, Secretary Fox summed things up like this. We're moving into the Jetsons era, but we have Flintstone approaches to authority and regulation. And we can't go the distance with this until we really think about things differently. So, in transportation policy, we need to think differently because of technology. And we did. This is one of the things I worked on in the White House, along with Secretary Fox's team, with the experts at the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, and with colleagues across the White House. The stakes in self-driving vehicles are high. Every year, about 36,000 Americans are killed on the roadway. 1 million are injured, and the financial cost imposed by accidents is many hundreds of billions of dollars every year. Why? Because people are terrible at driving. Machines can do this a lot better. It's practically a certainty that machines will be much safer as drivers, saving many thousands of lives every year, eventually. And they'll give mobility to the elderly, the disabled, and everybody who can't drive. Not to mention giving us back the time that we're currently spending commuting by letting us use it to do other things. All of that will happen eventually. So the policy question is not whether we want a future with self-driving cars, because we do. The question is, how do we get there? How do we get to a future where self-driving cars are affordable, legal, and safer than human-driven cars? And how do we get there as soon as we can, because people are dying on the highways every day? That's the destination, but the route to get there is challenging. We don't want to let a high-tech vehicle on the roads if it's not safe. And we don't want to keep it off the roads too long if it is safe. But how can we find out if it's safe except by putting it on the roads? If we're going to do this right, if we're going to navigate this situation, we need good engineering and good policy to work together. Which brings us to the Federal Automated Vehicles Policy, which was released in the fall of 2016. I played a minor role in this, and I do emphasize relatively minor role. Putting something like this together and getting it right so it will have the desired impact and won't get snagged on any one of 1,000 different possible problems or issues requires a team of people with different expertise from across the government. You need experts on auto safety, things like airbags and braking. You need experts on software and automation. You need experts on the structure of and economics of the auto industry. You need experts on the software industry. You need lawyers who understand what the Department of Transportation is allowed by law to do. You need experts on regulatory policy who can map out how to get regulations changed to smooth the way for responsible testing with these vehicles. You need people who understand how these issues are viewed in Congress and in state governments and by other stakeholders, and so on. Leave any of these people off the team, leave out any of this expertise, and you'll probably make a mistake that sets back the timeline, or worst case, sinks the whole thing. To get this done, you need to build a consensus among all of these people, which is what happened. This policy on automated vehicles was very well received, and I think it's one of the under-recognized successes of the Obama administration. And it relied fundamentally on having a sophisticated understanding of the technology and how it was likely to develop at the table. When you work at the White House, you are always on call, every moment. At any time, your phone could ring or buzz, and it's time to go to work. Because much of the work that you do is driven by events. An example is the terrorist attack that happened in San Bernardino, California on December 2nd, 2015. 3 days later, I had that experience that you see in the movies. My plane landed at Washington Reagan Airport. I ran through the airport and out to the taxi stand, jumped in a taxi and said, "Take me to the White House." Not that I was a central part of responding to the attack, but it was all hands on deck. I had a role to play, and an important person said he wanted me there. I spent much of the following day helping with the preparation of one part of the president's speech, in which he commented on the role of the technology community in responding to terrorism. People listen very carefully to what the president says. Every word he says gets parsed and interpreted by the press and by interested members of the public. So White House staff took great care in considering what those words should be, with the president's guidance, of course, and always with the president having the last word as to what he would say. So we got guidance from above on what the tone and message ought to be, and then we tried to recommend the exact right words to get that right. I spent many hours working to influence what ended up as just a few words in the speech, and I was just one of the people working on that. After the speech, the White House team followed up with technology industry leaders. This led to a face-to-face meeting in January 2016 in San Jose, California, between senior government leaders and senior technology executives. You might have seen coverage of that in the press. Everything about the meeting was carefully planned and orchestrated. On the day of the meeting, as the starting time approached, the government folks were safely inside the building and the perimeter was secured. We were ready to go as soon as the tech leaders arrived. And that's when one senior official, who I won't identify, decided it was time for a Starbucks run. Here you see Dennis McDonough, the White House Chief of Staff, Jay Johnson, the Secretary of Homeland Security, and Tony Blinken, the Deputy Secretary of State, coming back from Starbucks. I was actually here too. That's my right shoe. For some reason, the photographer from The Guardian thought I was less newsworthy than these three. What you don't see in this photo is the Secret Service agents who came along. I'll never forget the looks we got when we walked into the Starbucks. This is not something you see every day on a street corner in downtown San Jose. 5 middle-aged white guys, massively overdressed in nearly identical dark suits, accompanied by a guy in a military uniform and a few very fit, very alert people with short haircuts who stationed themselves at all the entrances to the Starbucks. The people in the Starbucks knew that something very unusual was happening, but they couldn't figure out what it was. And then we walked back right past the waiting camera crews. So much for keeping a low profile. Technology plays a big role in military affairs as well. Here's Bob Work, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, talking about the third offset strategy, the military's drive toward a new technology-enabled approach to combat. All right, so Why do we call it the third offset? Well, the first offset was the approach taken in the 1950s and 60s to counter the Soviet Union's advantage in conventional weaponry in Europe by building a nuclear deterrent. The second offset was a complex of technologies from around the 1970s, including things like stealth, precision-guided weapons, night vision, and so on, that gave the United States and its allies a dominant advantage against the adversaries of that era. But now, today, the advantages of the second offset are eroding, and the military is seeking a third offset, another complex of technologies that will give a dominant advantage over would-be adversaries. And that is driven by technology. In particular, it's largely driven by artificial intelligence, machine learning, and automation. Here's a current US military drone. This is not an autonomous technology. It's operated by a person by remote control. A person looks at camera images and other sensors that are on the vehicle. The person controls the maneuvers, selects targets, and ultimately pulls the trigger to engage a target. But it's not hard to see where the technological logic here leads, if left to itself. As capabilities advanced to automate functions like navigation, image analysis, and tactical reasoning, the technological logic left to itself leads to greater autonomy. It leads to a vehicle that navigates, that analyzes on board with computers what the vehicle is seeing, that moves to evade incoming fire, and that logic also leads toward the vehicle itself using computers to select targets. Which brings us to some very difficult moral and legal questions about when it's acceptable for a machine to make or be involved in the decision to kill a person in a military setting. We have to decide what our policy is going to be about this. The Department of Defense has a policy and has had for 5 years a policy on autonomy in weapons systems. It's a good framework for dealing with these issues, but there's a lot of questions that it doesn't answer and can't answer. The bedrock principles on this issue are absolutely clear. The actions of the United States military, always and everywhere, have to be consistent with international humanitarian law, which requires that we distinguish legitimate military targets from other people and things, that we properly weigh the risk of collateral damage to non-combatants, and so on. I'm not going to give you a full dissertation on international humanitarian law, but suffice it to say that there are broad and comprehensive principles that we are supposed to be following and do. The principles of international humanitarian law tell us everything we need to know in principle, but in practice we have to figure out how those principles need to be put into action as we make concrete decisions about how to design, test, govern, and use weapon systems. For example, if we need to determine quickly whether a particular person is a combatant, when is it okay to let that determination be made entirely by a machine? Does the answer change if there is strong evidence that the machine is actually better, more accurate at that task than a person is? And what would the nature of that evidence be? What kind of evidence would we need to have confidence that a machine was as effective or perhaps even more effective than a person in making this determination? There are no easy answers to these questions, but these decisions are facing our military and the people devising its strategy. These are live questions now, in the sense that we are now setting the directions that will govern the way we deal with these issues in the future. As automated weapons become technologically feasible, we need to figure out how to reconcile our goal of having an effective military, a military that protects American interests and the democratic values, and how to reconcile that with our humanitarian obligations. And we're going to need to make a lot of specific choices. Today, our strategy for ensuring that our use of weapons is consistent with international humanitarian law and with our values has been multifaceted and continues to be. We rely on a combination of how weapons are designed, how they're tested, how our personnel are trained, and on the rules of engagement that we give to troops out in the field. And the last line of responsibility is always a person, guided by training and rules of engagement and their own judgment. We have some really hard thinking to do here. And because we're going to need to rely on design and on testing as part of the strategy, We need to have the best technical expertise and judgment at the table to make this decision well. The stakes here are high. Our military is also thinking about what potential rivals might be doing. If other powers are developing autonomous weapons, how might we counter them? And what about non-state actors who might not be limited by international norms or by humanitarian law? Already, some adversaries are reportedly using small drones against American forces on the battlefield. And we need to be thinking about how to protect against other threats. How might we detect, prevent, or disrupt attempts to use this technology for great harm internationally or domestically? Again, technical insight has to be a key input to this strategy. These decisions are coming, and we need to be figuring out how to make them. So in military affairs, technology also plays an important role in policymaking. I could go on. I could talk about other policy areas. I could talk about medicine and the role of personalized medicine and the combination of machine learning with genetic technology. I could talk about finance and the role of automated trading or new technologies like blockchain and smart contracts. I could talk about education and so on. Wherever you look across the spectrum of policy areas, you see technology is driving change, and you see new policy questions that are opened up by that change. Not just problems caused by technology, but also opportunities that technology creates. In short, if you're doing technology and policy, there's no end of things to work on. All right, let's take another detour to talk about where I worked. Here's an aerial photo. Over here you see the White House. This is the main big part of the White House called the mansion. That's the part you normally see in pictures. Over here, this is the West Wing. You see this oval thing here. And this is the Eisenhower Executive Office building. This is the building that almost all of the White House staff works in, and it's where my office was as well. It's an amazing building in itself. It was built in the 1870s and 80s. At that time, it was the largest office building in the world. And it was built deliberately, not in the same architectural style as most of the other government buildings, but in what was at the time construction started, the latest hot architectural style, French Second Empire style. Unfortunately, by the time construction ended 18 years later, this was no longer in style. The building was considered an eyesore for most of the first century of its existence. Mark Twain famously called it the ugliest building in America. But I beg to differ, and in fact, nowadays it's considered an architectural gem. Here's a shot from inside the EEOB. This is just outside of the Chief Technology Officer's office. You see one of the building's 6 internal domes with a round glass window at the top. And you see the famous checkerboard hallways. If you're a fan of the show Veep, you see a lot of people walking on checkerboard hallways. In the real building, these are made of marble. And the dark tiles contain quite a few fossils. One of my memories of the job will always be on my very first day in the office, walking down the hallway with the president's science advisor, looking for fossils in the floor. The office space is nothing to write home about. If you're a Princeton graduate student, you know what I'm talking about. Here's an action shot. My colleagues Suhas, Aiden, and DJ. But one thing to note is that in this picture, if you look carefully, you will see that you can see 7 desks. And at a busy time, all 7 desks would have people at them. Here's me at my desk. This narrow piece of furniture here, that's my desk. That's my workspace. It's my entire workspace, storage, and filing space. When I moved out, everything in my desk fit into half of a printer paper box. You also see our office whiteboard. It contains our office memes like #courage. That came up a lot. A photo of my colleague Evan eating a taco up there at the top, and a whole bunch of to-do lists. On the left is my colleague Tara's desk, and although you don't see it here, the photographer is standing at my colleague Alex McGillivray's desk. Alex had to move so that this picture could even be taken. You'll also note that I'm scandalously underdressed by White House standards. The Chief of Staff referred to dressing like this as going CTO. You know, those crazy tech people. Because the scope of tech policy is so broad, and our team of tech advisors was relatively small, I ended up working on a bunch of areas that I wouldn't have anticipated. One of them was artificial intelligence. The interest in AI was driven by big technical advances in the field that have happened in recent years, especially advances in machine learning, and also by growing commercial interest and investment in AI. When you hear companies like Google and IBM talk about how they're reinventing their companies around artificial intelligence, people in government notice. The attention to AI was also driven to a lesser extent by the robot apocalypse. At least that's what we took to calling it around the office. Now, this is actually a thing that people talk about. The concern is that we engineers will create an artificial intelligence that is smarter than people across the full range of cognitive and intelligence-related tasks. In fact, eventually much smarter than us, and that we'll lose control of it. And if you think about it, if we do make something that's a lot smarter than us, and if its values are not very closely aligned with human values, then we have a big problem. We could be in big, big trouble. Famous smart people like Elon Musk, Stephen Hawking, and Bill Gates started talking about this as an existential threat to humanity. Maybe not a super high probability threat, but a risk that was worth worrying about. And when famous smart people start talking about existential risk, important people notice and start asking questions. Philosophers even wrote fancy books about the robot apocalypse. All of this, mostly the big private sector interest, the technical advances, but maybe the robot apocalypse a little bit too. All of this led to the creation of the White House's Artificial Intelligence Initiative. This was a big effort. We worked with private institutions to co-organize 5 conferences held around the country over a 7-week period. Here's the first one. This was at the University of Washington in Seattle. We put together a big White House report on AI and a companion strategic plan for AI research and development. Putting together a report like this and getting it approved through the interagency review process is a topic all its own. This could be the topic of a whole separate talk, although that would be the most boring talk ever. So I'll resist the temptation to give it. But to give you some perspective, let me tell you that before it could be published, this report was sent for review to the Departments of Agriculture, Defense, Commerce, Energy, Education, Health and Human Services, Homeland Security, Interior, Justice, Labor, State, Transportation, and Treasury, and to NASA, the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, the CIA, the Director of National Intelligence, and the EPA. And to the Council of Economic Advisors, the Domestic Policy Council, the National Economic Council, National Security Council, the Office of Management and Budget, and the Office of Science and Technology Policy. That's not a complete list. And I haven't even mentioned the lawyers who reviewed it. So that sounds like a lot, and indeed, getting all of those entities comfortable enough with the report to release it is, believe me, not a task for the faint of heart. But virtually every one of those departments, agencies, and offices did have some knowledge or perspective that actually spoke to the topics that the report was addressing. Every one of those entities had something useful to say. So although the process of getting this stuff reviewed and approved is incredibly cumbersome, there is a reason for that. Now, in this report, we identified one issue that merited a separate report of its own. That is how AI and automation will affect the economy, and especially how it will affect the job market. We published that one as a separate report in December of 2016. I worked on this one with colleagues on the Council of Economic Advisors, National Economic Council, Domestic Policy Council, and Office of Management and Budget. As always, lots of people around the table bringing different expertise. So the big question we dealt with here is, how is automation, driven by artificial intelligence and machine learning, how is this going to affect the economy and what we can do about it? Or to put it more colorfully, are robots going to take all of our jobs? Now, I talked before about self-driving vehicles, and they could have a big effect on the job market because more than 3 million Americans work as drivers. That's almost 2% of the US workforce. My colleagues at the Council of Economic Advisors estimated that 2 million or more of those jobs could be at risk due to automation. And when you talk about 2 million jobs being put at risk, people pay attention, as they should. And it's not just self-driving cars. Automation has been transforming workplaces, of course, for a long time. You could go all the way back to the Industrial Revolution or before. The history of automation and jobs is an interesting topic in itself, which I don't have time for today, although that section of the White House report makes excellent reading. Despite all the talk about trade driving job market changes today, it's likely that automation has been a bigger driver of change. President Obama talked about this in his farewell address. He said, "I agree that our trade should be fair and not just free. But the next wave of economic dislocations will not come from overseas. It will come from the relentless pace of automation that makes a lot of good middle-class jobs obsolete." Over the past 8 years, the economy experienced healthy job growth, climbing out of a deep hole after the financial crisis. But there are some very worrisome long-term trends that have been unfolding over recent decades in the job market. For example, labor force participation, that is, the fraction of adults who are active in the active labor force, has been steadily decreasing for a long time. This graph here shows labor force participation for men in blue and women in red from about 1950 up to the present. The gray vertical bars here denote recessions. And you see here two big things happening. Big thing number one is the large flow of women into the workforce from 1950 up to about 2000. That's driven by social changes that opened the workplace much more to women than before. Going along with that positive trend, we see another trend that's much more worrisome, and that is a decline over time in workforce participation. You see this for men from around 1950, where you're up around 87% of adult men in the workforce, to present, where it's dipped below 70%. And if you look at the curve in labor force participation from women, what you see is that once you reach this plateau around 2000, after this large flow of women into the workforce, that the curve for women starts to go down as well, paralleling the curve for men. And so there seems to be a long-term trend in reduced labor force participation. Now you might ask, is this because the population is aging? Well, that effect isn't nearly large enough to explain this. Is the decline among men because their female partners are coming into the labor force and the men are then going out? That also doesn't explain these data. There seems to be a long-term trend toward a reduction in labor force participation. Other long-term trends include a stagnation over recent decades in the median wage in the United States, as well as increasing inequality in income and in wealth. Now, the causes of all of this are complicated, and economists debate how much of this to attribute to various factors. But the contributing factors seem to include automation, globalization, changes in tax policy and other aspects of policy, and a few other factors. So as the new wave of automation arrives, there are two big questions that we have to ask to understand what's going to happen. Who's going to be affected, and how fast are the changes going to happen? And by the way, it's not just physical work that will be affected. In previous generations, robots mostly displaced routine physical work, a job that involved tightening the same bolt over and over or making the same weld over and over would likely have been displaced by robots in the past. But AI could displace work that is mental in addition to physical, and work that is non-routine in addition to routine. For example, certain tasks that are done today by radiologists, looking at scans of people's bodies and interpreting them to support a diagnosis. Some of those can already be done by computers as well as or better than expert human radiologists. Sometimes the computers are better. So some high skill jobs may also be affected. How do we know which work is going to be affected and when? That requires forecasting what the technology will be able to do in the next few years. Here's an analysis based on the best literature that exists. On the left is an analysis by my colleagues at the Council of Economic Advisors. And what this shows is that according to the best estimates that were available from the literature, that about 83% of US jobs that pay a wage of $20 or less would be affected by automation. About 31% of jobs in a middle range of wage, and only about 4% of jobs paying more than $40 an hour would likely be affected. On the right is a graph from an academic paper that shows, that estimates that of the jobs of the jobs requiring less than high school education to do, roughly 44% include highly automatable skills that are likely to be replaceable by automation, up to approximately 0% for jobs requiring a graduate degree, or 1% of jobs requiring a bachelor's degree. So stay in school, kids. Now, these graphs are very worrying, but they should also be taken with a really big grain of salt. Because although these are the best estimates we have, there is a lot of uncertainty here. And in fact, the authors of both of these graphs urge caution in interpreting them. The CEA graph is based on the best estimate of which job functions are likely to be automatable. But that, of course, is just an estimate. And indeed, as it turns out, the underlying estimate of which jobs are automatable that led to this was itself done by a machine learning model. They took a subset of the job descriptions and automated those, used those to train a model, and then the model produced data about which jobs were likely automatable across the full range of job functions. So ironically, this was done in a way that displaced the work of a bunch of economics grad students, which I think contradicts this. Anyway, my own opinion is that there is a lot of uncertainty about how these effects are going to be felt. We don't know, we can't even say for sure that the biggest impact will be on lower wage jobs. That seems more likely than not, but we can't say for sure. What we do know, though, is that the effects of automation on the job market are likely to be felt unevenly. They're likely to be felt unevenly across geographic regions, across ages, across education levels, and across job functions. How do we get better estimates? Once again, we need to bring technology experts to the table. People who know a lot more than I do about AI and machine learning could help to produce better estimates of which job tasks are likely to be automatable in the coming years. Then economists can help to figure out what that means for the job market. And that, in turn, would enable a better policy discussion about how we should respond. Now, I don't want to get too negative in talking about this issue, because there are at least two reasons to be really hopeful about how our economy will deal with automation. First, artificial intelligence can do a lot to make American workers more productive. And productivity growth is one of the main factors that drives improvement in our standard of living. Productivity growth has not been as robust in recent years as one would like, and AI is one of the things that can help to increase it. If American workers produce more, then there will be a larger pie, which in the long run, with the right policies, will help everybody. So turning away from the technology is not the right approach. In fact, Jason Furman, the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors when I was there, said in a speech that the first thing he had to say about AI is that we don't have enough of it. The second reason to be more hopeful is that the American economy is incredibly dynamic. Talking about 2 million drivers being displaced, that sounds like a lot. And it is a lot. But in our economy, about 2 million jobs disappear every month. And of course, they're replaced by the creation of 2 million plus some. So our economy can absorb large changes, can absorb large movements of workers in the long run, and it can emerge stronger than ever if we have the right policies in place. But we can't lose sight of the fact that these dislocations cause real pain for the workers and communities that are affected. And that our economy will not continue to be strong, and forces pushing toward economic inequality will not solve themselves if we don't have the right policies in place. Or, as my favorite sentence in our Automation and the Economy report said, technology is not destiny. Technology is driving a lot of the changes that are happening in our society, and it shows up in so many of our most important policy challenges. When important decisions are being made, when policy directions are being set, we need to have technical expertise in the room. I was really encouraged by the steps taken by the Obama administration to move in that direction. But we have a long way to go before agencies and offices across the federal government and in state and local governments have the technology policy capabilities that they need. Which is why I'm now going to point the Uncle Sam finger at all of you, and especially at the young computer scientists in the room. Important decisions are going to be made, decisions that lay down the framework for how our society is going to be built in the future. And we need to have people like you working on these issues. We need to have you in the room when the decisions are made. There are a lot of ways that you can get involved. You can do a tour of duty in the government like I did, or you can make it a career. You can work with a nonprofit as an employee or as a volunteer. You can work with the state or local government. They interact directly with most citizens more than the federal government does. But what we need you to do, for the sake of your fellow citizens, is to listen to Uncle Sam and listen to Rosie the Riveter and step up. Princeton's motto, in the nation's service and the service of humanity, that's not just for public policy majors. That's for you computer scientists too. For me, public service has been an incredibly rewarding experience. And I think it will be for you too. So I'd urge you to take that step. Thank you. Okay, we have time for questions. Here. Yes, sir.
I have a small question. So I think this is as close as some of us will get to President Obama, like former President Obama. So could you describe it like a personal experience, how it was interacting with him?
How it was interacting with President Obama? Sure, let me tell a couple of stories. The question, I'll repeat the question for those who are on the video. The question is, can I give a little bit more of a picture of what President Obama is like? And let me tell you a couple things. The first thing is that I was incredibly impressed by, first of all, how hard a job it is to be president. I got to see a little bit of that. And how much he did to prepare for everything he had to do. So I showed that picture in the Oval Office of a meeting. And the night before that meeting, he had in his homework book that he gets sent home with at the end of the day, a memo that I and many other people had written describing the topic and everything we were going to talk about. And it was, including appendices, maybe 30-ish pages. He got a big book every night, which he would take home. And after his teenage daughters went to bed, he would read it. Next day, he knew everything in the book. They told me before the first meeting, just assume he knows everything in the book, everything in the appendices, and so on. And indeed, that was true in the meeting. And even months later, he would repeat back things, facts and figures from that memo that he had read months before. This is from a guy who reads this much stuff every night. It was really super impressive in that respect. Let me tell you a little bit more of a personal story, though. Around the West Wing and around, to a lesser extent, around the Eisenhower building where I worked, they would often have photos taken by the White House photographer. Pete Souza, the White House photographer during the Obama administration, is a national treasure. He's the one who took the photo that I showed you there in the Oval Office. But Pete was always around when President Obama was doing almost anything. And they would post Pete's pictures on the walls around the building. And it was a great way for staff who, like me, didn't get to see the president very often at all to see what was going on. And one thing you note in watching this over time is some of the best pictures are the president with little kids, and especially babies. Like down on the ground, looking at a baby who's right next to him, and actually seeming to genuinely have fun. And we actually saw this. My family actually saw this. We were privileged to get a chance to have a meet and greet with him in the Oval Office on my very last day at work. And the family that was in front of us in the line to do that had a little girl who got kind of freaked out going into the Oval Office, which, to be fair, I did too the first time. President Obama got down on his knees, and he calmed her down, and he gave her a hug. I just looked and said, that's a dad. And if you think about it, one thing that I saw immediately in dealing with him is that when he's in the office, he is never not the president, right? He can't just be a guy. As much as your colleagues say, just talk to him like he's a guy you respect, the fact is he's always the president. Everyone in the room knows it. But babies don't know that he's the president. Over here on the aisle.
Given your research interest in voting technology, I was wondering, did you have an opportunity to brief the president about it? And also, why did it take him so long to finally decide that it was necessary to have better security?
So the question is, did I get a chance to brief the president about voting technology, and why was and why did it take as long as it did to get a statement on that topic? Is that a fair summary of your question? First of all, I have to say that we don't, and I'm not going to go into detail about what we did or didn't talk to the president about in terms of specific issues. I will say that the administration and the White House was certainly aware of issues of risk around voting technology, around specifically the technology of the election, the casting and counting of votes, and took that issue very seriously. It's not always the case when you don't hear public statements that nothing is happening. It is an issue that we took seriously. It's an issue that I did some work on, and it's going to continue to be an issue. As those of you who know my research from before I went into government probably know, I've expressed a lot of skepticism about the security of the technologies used to cast and count votes, including the technologies used here in New Jersey. I think as a nation, we're not where we need to be on that topic. And that's a topic that I intend to continue working on. And it is something that, it is an issue in which it's difficult to make progress for a lot of issues that you know. Sir? Yes?
Yeah, I was very much impressed with the issue of automation. Okay? I saw a report about a year ago on the Sloan School of Management at MIT on automation and robots.
Mm-hmm.
And their conclusion was that in the economy, one issue that must be considered is division of wealth,
Yes.
which is essentially a socialistic issue. It's an ideological in the policy issues. From your experience in the White House, do you feel the people are open-minded there ideologically to understand that sometimes you have to take issues which are not necessarily popular?
Okay, right, so to repeat the question referred back to a Sloan School study about automation. Sloan School of Management, MIT, and talking about it as a potential driver of income inequality. And was that an issue that we could take on given its political valence and sensitivity?
Division of wealth,
Yes.
part of the tax structure.
Questions about wealth, division of wealth, and taxation, and all of this.
That's right.
These are issues that get discussed a lot. And if you look at the report we did on automation and the economy, we do discuss these issues. My personal view is that this is one of the most important big picture policy issues that we as a country face. The way in which and that really goes to some of those long-term worrisome economic trends I talked about. The way in which in recent decades the improvement in the economy in an average sense has not led to improvement for people who are in the lower half of the income distribution. That I think is very worrisome, and it's not something which has happened throughout our history. It's not something that has happened in every country of the world. It's not something that has happened in every well-developed Western economy. To a significant extent, the outcomes that we've gotten in this respect are consequences of policy choices we've made that we could have made differently and that we can change. So I think that's a topic that we very much need to have open. Not being an economist, but having talked a lot with some of the nation's best economists about this issue, I do think this is one of the most important questions we can be asking. Down here.
Do you think sort of piggybacking, do you think a federal living wage is an option in the near future in the U.S.?
Do I think a federal living wage is an option in the U.S.? There's different ways of looking at that. So one way of interpreting that question is about increase in the minimum wage. And to me, that is partly an empirical, it's partly a question about economics, right? If by increasing the minimum wage, we would not lead to significant decrease in the number of people employed, then it seems like a good policy. But beyond a certain point, I think economists agree that there comes a point where if we increase minimum wage past that point, then we start to lose employment in ways that are not that are harmful. And to me, it's a practical question of what that point is and how would we know. The other approach that some people have suggested along the lines perhaps of what you are talking about is a universal basic income. And that's the idea which has been floated by economists from the left and right over the years to provide a guaranteed minimum income to every American. So the simplest version of this would simply just send a check for X dollars to every American every month or every year. And there are different variations of it. Does it replace existing social safety net programs or not, et cetera. And there's some discussion of that, again, in our report on automation and the economy. There's not an easy solution here. The problem is that if you have an approach which is very simple and large enough to really deal with the magnitude of the need, then it costs an enormous amount of money. So for example, writing a check to every American that is equal to, let's say, the poverty level for a one-person family, that would double federal spending. We'd be spending 28% of GDP, roughly, just to do that. And that's clearly not affordable. And the fiscal impact of that, the indirect impact of that on our economy would be enormous. But then as soon as you step back from a pure and simple program, then it gets complicated and you end up making a lot of the same trade-offs that you make that have been made in designing the social safety net programs we have. So this is really hard, and one of the things I really came to appreciate in working on this issue is how detailed these questions are and the importance of practical knowledge about how these programs work and what's known in the literature about the impact of doing this thing versus that thing. There are a lot of policy responses that seem good in principle that are a lot more complicated when you talk about what you'd actually need to put them into practice.
Regarding security and policy, what caused the sudden progress in Chelsea Manning's case?
Sorry, the sudden progress in?
In
Chelsea Manning's case. So the question is, what caused the sudden progress in Chelsea Manning's case? So Chelsea Manning, of course, was convicted of leaking information about U.S. military activities in Iraq and Afghanistan, if I remember correctly, and her sentence was commuted by President Obama near the end of his time. I don't know I don't know a detailed answer to that question, but ultimately the decision to commute a sentence is usually driven by a conclusion that the person has already paid a large enough penalty for the thing that they did. And I think ultimately that's what drove it. There's no doubt from people who have paid attention to this that Chelsea Manning served substantial time in prison, and much of it under conditions that that were much more difficult than they probably needed to be. And I think there was just an instinct toward mercy based on the idea that she had suffered enough. Here in the middle.
Yeah.
Yes.
When are these self-driving cars going to start being pursued by self-driving police cars?
When will self-driving cars be pursued by self-driving police cars? Well, so they're already pursued by red light cameras. I think, well, so obviously law enforcement, the question is funny and actually interesting in itself, but the idea of how law enforcement has been and will be using technology to try to detect violations and even to try to stop people who are fleeing in a dangerous way, that I think that's a very real question. And certainly there are probably safer ways of stopping a person who's fleeing on the highways than chasing them with a fast car that is occupied by police officers. But I don't actually know anything more specific than that. Sorry. Toward the back here. Yes?
How would you interpret the current political landscape in the context of technology policy and your work at the White House? And relating to the current slide, what do you think we in this room can do to impact that for good?
How would I interpret the current political landscape with respect to technology policy, and what can you in the room do to improve it? Well, it's complicated. Many of these issues are not partisan in the traditional sense. Self-driving car policy, for example, fundamentally not a partisan issue. Drone policy, similarly, you see leaders of both parties would like to move responsibly toward allowing greater latitude for the use of drones for commercial and other purposes. The question is how. So on those issues where the discussion is about how, then it's about bringing your expertise, bringing your commentary, doing research and development, product development that helps to resolve the issue, and trying to keep it on this how do we solve the problem nonpartisan setting. Other issues become partisan. Some issues can even flip their partisan valence. For example, issues around election technology. It tends to be the case that the party that won the last election thinks everything is fine, and the party that lost the election thinks that we shouldn't really trust the way elections have been conducted recently. You see that pattern. And that's unfortunate because, and there the challenge is to figure out how to talk to everybody in a way that you can have a productive conversation. Because I think people who are experienced in politics know that the day will come when they're on the other side of that discussion. Also, I have to say that today, moving our political discussion in a direction that is based on facts and depth and sophistication of discourse is incredibly important. And modeling that, setting an example, doing that, and not settling for less is, I think, incredibly important and one of the most important things that anybody, especially academics, can do. Karen.
Again, going off of the previous question, not making it too political, I'm curious, from your experience, do you think, based on what has happened recently, that technological progress in machine learning in particular is in jeopardy because of blaming this everything on trade and going into more protectionist mode? And what could the government do more to better educate the public in this?
All right. So the question is, do I worry, in the current environment, do I worry that progress in machine learning and artificial intelligence are at risk because of backlash over, say, the jobs issue? And what could government do to help with that? I'd say two things in response to that. I don't think we should ignore the risk that automation and machines will become will be blamed for economic changes. I think we need to be sensitive to that. And we can do that in a few ways. One is by taking the problem seriously, right? And it's not enough to just say, well, in the long run, everyone will have a job, we'll be fine, because in the short run, people are suffering, and we need to take that seriously. So that's part of it, I think. We need to take the issues seriously, and we need to be sensitive to the issues here and the issues of inequality. And not everybody in the tech community is always good at that. That's number one. Number two, what should government do? Well, this was one of the reasons why we wanted to have a public discourse about this, issue reports, hold conferences, have speeches by the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, and all of that. One of the things that we believed, and this was part of the tone that came from the top, was that you deal with difficult issues by having a grown-up conversation with the people of the United States about it. And we sought to do that, to engage expert communities, but also to reach out to the public and to do that in a way that people would appreciate and would be accessible. And I think that's something that the technical community needs to do. Because like it or not, if you are a developer of this technology, if you're running a company, working in a company, you're seen as a representative of a community that is often seen as not paying enough attention to the harm that it causes. And often that is for good reason. The way I've taken to talking about this with folks is in terms of sustainability. We'd like this technology to develop in a way that's sustainable, meaning that in a way that people can accept it, where we've been thoughtful about mitigating the negative consequences that it might have, and where people who are not technologists and don't know about the technology, don't own it, don't feel so much like the world is getting out of control. And I think that's a joint responsibility. And you see some of the companies that are making the biggest investments in AI and machine learning starting to do that, starting to pay attention to these issues, forming groups like the Partnership for AI and so on. I think that's all a positive step. But really, it's for all of us to do this right. I see the hands up, but I think at this point it makes sense to adjourn to informal conversation. We have a nice reception outside, and I'd be happy to answer questions, further questions from any of you out there. Thanks.